If I am so lifted, I would say in my language, which is perhaps different from yours, right? Gregory, you are not decontextualizing this mandala. You are quite the reverse. You are endowing it with context, right? You're making it either into something within a context, or you are making it into a context marker, an indication that if there's this mandala in the center of this room, this must mean that we all, are not engaging in a worship, but that what we are engaging in is ipso facto labeled as a worship by that mandala. That makes some sense? Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I'm answering, you see, the reverse of the question which you asked me. The question which you asked was, why, if you decontextualize people, quote, will they start seeing mandalas and similar things? You account for it by noting that people seeing this are doing things to this as either as a context marker or as something within a context, and therefore we are in a world of special treatment of contexts. And this is a world of visionary states, enlightenments, and such things. All right, now let that stand for a moment. And at one level, this is a rather nasty positivist repudiation, in a sense, of visionary states and such things. Let us now consider what we might get from all this. You see, visionary states, it's all very well to say they are a result of discombobulating people's contextual what's it. On the other hand, there is an open question coming in, as an intellectual, the way I do. There is still an open question whether the control, the determination, the determinism that context, as I see it, imposes upon my ways of thinking, whether that determinism is not in some degree an impoverishment. That is there in some sense an enrichment to be gotten by monkeying with my control and perception of context, by decontextualizing it? That's the question, you see. The purpose, we were talking about him this morning or yesterday afternoon, I can't remember. He is being trained to do something new whenever he comes on stage. There's an audience there, a trainer. The trainer says to the audience, I'm going to show you how we train porpoises. When he comes on stage, I will watch him, and when he does something which I'll call a piece of behavior that I want him to repeat, I blow the whistle, give him a fish, you'll see him come over for the fish, and then he will go and do it again. And this is how we train them to do things we want them to do. But there are 5 shows a day, 4 shows a day, 6 days a week, something like that. And obviously it would be cheating to pick on the same piece of behavior each time. So in order that the porpoise may cooperate in the performance in front of that audience, he's got to do something new each time he comes on stage. And the porpoise was in fact doing this. And I observed this and said, this is very interesting. To learn to do something new is sort of a paradoxical piece of learning. Because what people learn is to do something which they know how to do after they've learned it. Right? To teach novelty is sort of self-contradictory. So we got a naive porpoise, and we trained her to the whistle and the fish, and set to work to not reward her every time she came on the stage for whatever she had been rewarded for last time and previous times. She was only to be rewarded for something, quote, new, unquote. She got very much exasperated. She would spend 2/3 of each learning session, they ran about 10 minutes, there were 3 sessions a day about. She would spend 2/3 to 3/4 of the session doing the thing which had been rewarded in the last session, but now not getting a reward for it. And then she would more or less accidentally do something which the trainer could think of as a something, and the trainer would then happily blow the whistle and give the porpoise a fish. The trainer, I may say, was longing to give the porpoise a fish all the way through, and indeed gave the porpoises a lot of unearned fish, because she said the exasperation will build up to a point at which I will lose my relationship with this porpoise. And the trainer has to, deal with that. So does the psychiatrist. No kidding, you can't consistently punish the symptoms. Indeed, it's a good idea to reward them. Where was I? Yeah. Between the 14th and the 15th session, the porpoise in its holding tank got enormously excited, splashed and jumped and dived and wiggled. And when she came on stage for the 15th session, she at once performed 12 absolutely brand new. Right. You see, she is in a situation in which she is essentially being penalized for having learned that which she has learned. This is a situation which drives her into a creativity. And this, in a sense, is the situation which drives critters and us into a creativity, unless we're bird and butterflies, you see, in which case we die. And this first paradigm I hung up is in fact not only the paradigm for the death of species that don't make it, it is the paradigm for the springboard, for the forcing of the next step in invention, perhaps evolution. I don't know whether you can force steps in evolution. This is a matter of some doubt. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Did everybody get it? Yeah, apropos of this, I'd love for you to comment just briefly on conceptual leaps.
Yeah, this is a conceptual leap. They're absolutely impossible. And from a purely theoretical point of view, no conceptual leap can conceivably be achieved. There are certain conditions necessary for it. It's still impossible, but under some circumstances, more impossible than others. Notice that the porpoise required a sample of learnings, of trials, in order to make its conceptual leap. It could not have done it at the first trial. The first trial, it solved its problem by doing something which the trainer thought was, a piece of behavior, and he got its whistle and fish and everything was fine. And then it has the next trial in which it has to go through this, and now it's not rewarded for doing that. And it's got to have a sufficient class of experiences, a sample of experience, multiple members of a class of the experience, before the leap is possible. This is important in a sort of formal way to argue that we are in fact dealing with a different logical type of learning, different from the learning in the first instance, which it solved its problem by doing a something. Right? I don't know whether we want to go into the nature of Russell's logical types and things like that tonight, but they're in there, and the fact that it takes a class of experiences of type 1 to achieve a jump up to logical type 2, the next level, this is theoretically exceedingly significant. It may not be particularly interesting to these.
What I think I'm getting at is that besides the class of experiences, which then provides a sort of baseline or feel when the leap can be taken, I feel like there's also an affective situation.
There's a hell of an affective situation.
Right, which has to do with what you might consider to be frustration. Frustration when the patterning capabilities of an individual begins to break down. And in terms of survival, the only thing one can do is to make the conceptual leap. Or
die.
Butterfly. Right?
Yeah. And don't forget the unearned fish.
That's it.
You see, now, there's a technical problem about unearned fish. If you want the porpoise to make the conceptual leap, the trainer is stuck with this threat. If I let the porpoise get too exasperated, she will no longer go on being my pupil, my client, my whatever shamans have. So I've got to throw some fish. And the problem is not to throw fish at those moments at which the porpoise might achieve the conceptual jump. You've got to throw the unearned fish at irrelevant moments, so to speak. And be ready, by God, with the whistle and fish for the moments when the porpoise makes the jump. Now, in this case, the jump is a very conspicuous business. If you're working with psychotics in a hospital, which God forbid, you have to be watching all the time for that moment of the jump to be able to say, that's it. And this is the main failing, I think, of all practicing psychiatry, that they're insufficiently ready to recognize the jump when it happens. And in fact, they require a multiple sample of the jump. This brings up another aspect of this whole business, which I don't know how to handle, but it's worth mentioning, I guess, perhaps for that reason. I set up the matter of stationary waves on water and invaded with single spikes into the water. But suppose the invasion were not by a single spike, but were itself an invasion by something as patterned, perhaps as having as complex internal dynamics as the stationary wave pattern. There is a whole series of patterns which are beginning to be of scientific and mathematical interest at the present time. These are called moire patterns. Moire is a French word meaning mohair. Mohair is an English word meaning moire, and it's a sort of fabric, a sort of woven fabric in which the color and quality of the weave looks different as you see it in a different light. In fact, it has a double weave structure so that one pattern somehow brings out another. Perhaps the most conspicuous form of it is if you take a piece of mosquito wash, mosquito shading from a window. It's got about a mesh of about 1 millimeter, either diameter or square, depending on the sort of mosquito wire you take, and you fold it on itself and grind it a little bit. You'll see patterns travel and jump and so on. These are moire patterns. And one gets, from fooling around with such things, if you try to make a definition of what you mean by a pattern out of the moire metaphor, you get a rather interesting definition in which patterns are sort of sexy things, in which you've got one of them and then you have two of them, you put them together, you get a third. And it's possible, that the fascinations of yin and yang and such juxtapositions of patterns, which are highly sexual matters, that the fun partly of this is that it is generative of another pattern. And the sexual metaphor is not entirely academic. So, you see, one of the things we do is not going around the world with a complex pattern in here ready to be poked with single simple stimuli, nor is it going around the world with pokers for poking complex patterns with single simple stimuli. Though this sort of is the first step of the paradigm to give you the metaphor with, and that's the step I took. What really happens is you go around the world with a sort of butterfly net. The butterfly net being a highly patterned business, and we put the butterfly net against the cannas, whatever that big yellow flower is, I don't know, and the others, and each other's faces and clothes, and how we sit, and are we sitting in a circle, and what is a circle, and etc., etc., etc. And our butterfly net of patterns, in a sense, may be said to catch patterns when it and they generate another.
Reflexive mode.
Yeah. Now, this, I think, has something to do with your thing about decontextualizing people and making them hallucinate.
No,
or whatever.
say it that way. You did, remember?
I know, and you said it wasn't right. You didn't say why it wasn't right.
Seeing the truth.
Was that?
We call it seeing the truth.
Ah, yes.
You got it now.
But of course. But which is the truth? The truth is that if you decontextualize, you will see things. And the fact that decontextualizing leads to your seeing things is a very noble and important truth about what it is to be a human being and what it is to be creative. This is part of the mechanisms of creativity. But whether the things you see are the truth, that's another question.
I wanted to ask you one thing. When you talk about the yin-yang, for example, or the patterns, you mentioned that you feel there's a special attraction, that those two elements can create a third element, which points in one direction, but I feel there's another aspect.
Well, those two being very arbitrarily chosen. There are millions of possibilities, no doubt.
But for example, in the yin-yang, I see also another possibility that it can go the other direction. Those two can be derived from some kind of undifferentiated unity that precedes them. Which you find in
that's conceivably true.
In the Hindu context, when they talk about the lila, the divine play, it goes from one to many and from many to one. That's the very basic nature of the game.
Yeah, and when Jonah asked me the question about decontextualizing in this direction, I answered it by the inverse direction, starting from this and going to the question of those contexts which are going to give this the quality of an enlightening stimulus.
For example, you have this intrinsic paradox in sex, in the sexual situation per se, that if the circumstances are right, the two individuals involved in sexual activity can actually transcend somehow their boundaries. They can, in a way, feel that they become one in the situation. But they can also...
Three or one?
Well, this is the other side of it. From that situation of intercourse, while they are transcending their differentiation, they can start another individual.
Indeed, yes.
In the other direction. So that you have that intrinsic inbuilt polarity that points in both directions.
I would agree with that. That makes sense in my language as well as in yours.
Stan, I wanted to ask a question about what you're talking about a minute ago. When the person is able to accept all the different levels of experiences, and he's, instead of hanging on to one, is that what you would call a conceptual jump?
Are you asking me or Joan?
I was asking Stan.
Stan, right.
Well, it certainly means leaving completely the old way you organized your experience, perception, the old conceptual framework, and accepting another one.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why we are telling people, by the way, in psychedelic sessions, don't try to understand where you're going. Don't try to understand every step, because what's going to happen? You will get to a place where you acquire all of a sudden a completely different way of looking at things. And as long as you're trying to understand each step, you're holding on to the old system. In other words, you're preventing yourself. The new place that you'll get to, you won't understand in terms of your old place.
Yeah.
In other words, we are telling them you first make the jump, and then somehow the new conceptual framework will come to you. You first experience, and then you will understand.
Yeah. A conceptual jump that is not something you take, but something that happens to you. That's fine. That's
the idea of using jump or leap is the fact that there's not, I know Gregory and Stan and I were discussing this a few weeks ago in Tucson. There's not a linear, irrational unfolding. It is a jump, and there's a kind of lacunae there, a space. And what fills that space? How do you get from alpha to omega? You don't proceed to the alphabet I mean, you're there. You're there.
That used to be called grace.
Grace.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Truly. You know, Joseph Campbell has a wonderful line in his book, Myths to Live By, that question of schizophrenics and visionaries. He says the mystic is swimming with delight in the same water in which the schizophrenic is drowning.
But isn't it so that the mystic does a good deal of drowning before he manages to find the other shore?
Actually,
Yeah.
you're our dear friend John Lillian. We were having a great chuckle about that last week. See, he seemed extremely mended, but we were chuckling because there was a preface in a recent book called Drugs and Magic, which eulogized him considerably, calling him a shaman crossing this dangerous chasm walking
On a
tightrope.
pedal bicycle, yeah.
Yes, something like that. At the bottom of which lay the broken souls of would-be shamans. And John and Stan and I were just giggling because we read it and we just said, well, actually, shamans hit the bottom of the pit, but what the shaman does, he bounces out of the pit and continues down the path. But I think the shaman has to be in touch with that experience of the bottom of the abyss in order to really be what he or she is.
Is anybody prepared to compare the bottom of the schizophrenic pit with the bottom of the alcoholic pit? I mean, I do know various cases well enough to feel pretty sure that the recovery from the schizophrenic pit, or the total void, should we say, leads to a certain special sorts of wisdom. I'm not convinced that the recovery from the alcoholic pit also leads to wisdoms. It may. Anybody have any views about that?
Well, isn't alcoholism somehow
I
related?
mean, there are also mushroom pits and other pits and psychedelic pits and so on. I'm not sure they all lead to wisdom, and I don't quite know which.
I couldn't make the generalization, although I do know many people who did, in their recovery from alcoholism, reach the wisdom level, and some who just did, some who just hung on to the day by day.
Who achieve sobriety without wisdom.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Really?
Yeah, there's a sentence in the big book there which says something about mere sobriety is not enough. From here you must go on to spiritual development. Some do, some don't.
Yeah.
We have done a lot of work with alcoholics, about 140 alcoholics put through psychedelic therapy. And I think we talked about it a little.
Yeah, you were saying that the psychedelic therapy is so much richer than the alcoholic experience, and they give up the alcohol in favor of
Yes,
it.
yes. Well, one important thing and interesting was that the incidence of a mystical experience, the death reverse experience, was much higher in the heroin and alcoholic group than, for example, in the neurotic group, or even in the training program. So psychiatrists, psychologists had psychedelic sessions, meaning that somehow alcoholics and heroin addicts are closer to the possibility of having that conversion, that total conversion experience. Now, I'm not sure that when you talk about hitting the alcoholic pit, that you're necessarily talking about experiencing the ego death rebirth.
This I'm not necessarily talking about.
I can see another.
Because there is the alcoholic jargon, their jargon, about hitting bottom, which is an AA jargon, Alcoholics Anonymous jargon.
But there's a possibility
which
that
is not
a
the same.
skid row alcoholic is on a down, downhill trip.
Yeah.
And then he gets into the dark night of the soul, which is an extremely scary area. And it scares him so much that he sobers up, but he doesn't sort of complete it. He doesn't really hit the bottom, at the point when he would experience a conversion, he just stopped his sort of downslide and he climbs up and puts it all together. But he hasn't really worked through, the forces that are involved. So I see the possibility. Some of them could get so scared of the areas that they are going into that it gives them an impetus to climb back and
Yeah, but it's not the same as
reconstitute.
having gone through.
But somebody can just go all the way,
This is
hit the
what's
bottom,
happened.
and
This
then
makes
from
sense.
there, of course, it's a different kind of recovery.
I'd like to ask you something.
Yeah.
Talking about when you mush up the context you're living in, and whatever you happen to see, like the pattern around there, you create a new context from that.
Yeah.
Then is there some difference with why some people won't be able to bring the two together, won't be able to have the understanding of awareness, will become schizophrenic, and other people will, and become, just have a bigger awareness. What's the missing deal there? The schizophrenic, you know what I mean?
I can give you an example from psychedelic work. Although schizophrenia and psychedelic states are not identical, but there is a parallel or similarity. The people whom we had in the professional training program, psychiatrists, psychologists who could have supervised psychedelic sessions, told me independently, quite a few of them, a very interesting observation. Say, when you take a psychedelic, you start losing the reality, the kind of organization of your experience that we call the usual or the normal consciousness. And then in various areas, in various sectors, you start breaking into some alternative levels of experiencing the world. Now, for all practical purposes, for purposes of reality testing and functioning in the world, as long as one sector of your experience is somewhere else and the rest of it is still hanging to the old level of organization, you're in trouble. Because then those two levels are competing and it distorts your perception of the world, your perception of yourself.
And seeing them in relation to each other distorts your old one.
Well, as long as you're partially in the other world.
Right, okay.
The moment you become totally crazy, in other words, that other reality just completely takes over, then you have two orientations. And for all practical purposes, in terms of relating to the world, you will be perfectly oriented. You will be functioning smoothly again. In other words, you can, for example, accept the fact that there are demonic forces in the world. Everything is run by deities that you have lived before. As long as you have totally accepted that other reality, in addition to the old organization, then you have two frameworks, and you can act on each of them in a fairly functional way. But if part of you is holding to the old concept, and you don't let the other concept totally penetrate and permeate and coexist with the old one, then you are in trouble.
Okay.
Because for a while you are acting on the old system, and then the next moment you're pulled in terms of the premises of the new one, but it's only in a certain sector.
Stan, is there an alternative there between being in trouble by playing the two levels simultaneously and suddenly finding that it's very funny?
Well, the moment you really feel it's funny, it means that you made a total synthesis. It's the moment not the kind of laughter which covers up anxiety, but if you really get the point of the joke, kind of aha experience, then you have really completed the Gestalt.
The moment of funniness is the moment when a Gestalt is closed,
Or completed.
completed. Sometimes that is certainly so. I don't know, I was hesitate to tell psychedelic stories in present company.
You're both friends.
So,
Everyone's family. It's not company.
This was Joe Adams was my bear leader. I was his. He incurred some of my wrath rather early in the game because I started to talk about what I wanted to get out of this psychedelic experience, and I was already getting quite a bit intoxicated, or whatever the word is. And he said, "Now wait a minute, let me get the tape recorder, and could you repeat that, please?" And he nearly got killed. However, I tell you this because it's part of the contextualization of the whole business. He wanted me to have some sort of transcendent experience, you know, which was kind. And he said, "But Gregory, you think too much. Stop thinking. Relax." And I said, "My job is thinking, Joe, you know. And I'm taking this stuff in order to find out more about thinking, of course. Especially I want to know about the relation between thought and aesthetics." "Oh, stop thinking," says Joe. So he goes out and he gets a rose. And I had at that time been considering the relations between evolution and thought, learning, we've been talking about tonight. And he said, "Well, now take a look at that rose." And I took a look at it and I said, "It's a lovely rose." "But Joe, think of all the thought that went into that rose." The second step, we sort of broke off for lunch. Lunch was a sort of interruption. And in that interruption, I turned on him and said, "You know, Joe, all this visual stuff, it's lovely, yes, but it's sort of trivial, you know." And he said, "What do you mean trivial?" And I said, "Well, it's like fracture planes in glass, or water breaking on a rock, or things of that kind, in which if there were no fracture planes, you couldn't see the glass. What you can see are only the fracture planes. And you see, Joe, fundamentally, Prospero was wrong when he said we are such stuff as dreams are made of. What he should have said was that dreams are bits and pieces of the stuff of which we are made. And what that stuff is, Joe, that's another story. This is something related to what you were saying to over there, isn't it? I don't know what that stuff is. And all the metaphors and the bird and butterflies and the rest of it are sort of bits and pieces, you know, of the stuff of which we are made.